Close your eyes and let the weight of the day slowly fade. Tonight, I invite you to drift with me, not into dreams just yet, but into the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, into the realm of a forgotten empire, the Assyrian Empire. Born from fire and ambition, the Assyrians rose from a small settlement by the Tigris River and became one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen. They built cities of stone and clay, raised armies that shook the earth, and carved stories into walls that still whisper through time. But like all empires, they too fell. They left behind ruins of palaces, broken statues, and silent libraries where once kings dreamed of immortality. Their story is not just of power and conquest, but of memory, wisdom, and the fragile nature of human ambition. In this long and quiet documentary, you will walk through the echoing halls of Ashur, Nineveh, and Nimrud. You will meet kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, whose names once caused entire nations to tremble. You will discover secrets of their armies, their letters, their gods, and their art. And in the end, you will witness the moment when this flame, once so fierce, faded into the shadows of history. So, make yourself comfortable. Rest your head. Breathe slowly. If you feel your eyes grow heavy as we move through this journey, let them close. The story will continue to flow like the Tigris itself. And before we begin, I invite you gently, if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, to subscribe so you can return again to other forgotten worlds, other sleeping empires. Now, let us begin. In the beginning, there was a river. The Tigris flowed like a silver thread through the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, giving life to soil that would one day bear cities, kings, and empires. Along its banks, a small community began to take shape. They called it Ashur, a name that was not only a city, but also a god. It was simple, modest, and fragile. Yet from this small settlement, the seed of one of the most formidable empires in human history was planted. Life in early Ashur was quiet. Mud brick houses rose beside temples, and markets filled with grain, fish, and livestock. Farmers bent their backs in the fields, drawing water through canals carved by hand. Traders crossed dusty roads with goods from Sumer and Akkad, and priests lit fires at altars, whispering prayers to their gods. Nothing about this life seemed destined for greatness, and yet beneath the surface, ambition stirred. The Assyrians learned to endure, to plan, to survive. In those early centuries, power was fragile. Ashur was not a mighty capital, but a town surrounded by larger, stronger kingdoms. To the south lay Babylon, with its proud temples and ancient traditions. To the north and east were wild lands filled with rival tribes. Ashur's people had to adapt, to defend themselves, and to build structures that would last. It was a childhood marked not by luxury, but by resilience. The god Ashur became more than a symbol. He was the heart of the people, the protector of their city, and the vision of their future. To serve him was to defend their land, to fight, and to grow. Every temple stone, every offering, every soldier's oath was tied to this divine presence. And in this union between God and people, the first spark of empire began to glow. Archaeologists today uncover fragments of these beginnings, clay tablets with names carved in wedge-shaped script, remnants of temples where smoke once curled into the sky, and walls that once enclosed a city trying to protect its fragile dream. From these pieces, we sense the determination of a people who refused to remain small. And so, from the riverbank and the rising sun, the story of Assyria begins. A story of survival, of ambition, of power slowly gathering strength. Like the river itself, the empire would one day surge forward with unstoppable force. But in this first chapter, we are still at the source, watching the ripples form in the quiet dawn of history. As centuries passed, the small city of Ashur grew in confidence. Its people learned to look beyond their modest walls, their eyes fixed on the trade routes that stretched across Mesopotamia. Caravans carried copper, tin, and fine textiles from distant lands. With each caravan that stopped in Ashur, wealth trickled in, and with wealth came influence. Slowly, Ashur was no longer just a city. It became a hub, a node in the great web of ancient commerce. But trade alone could not sustain power. The rulers of Ashur, known as Ensi, were careful men. They understood that survival required balance. Balance between pleasing the gods, keeping the loyalty of their people, and defending against enemies. They built temples, not just of devotion, but of legitimacy. To claim divine favor was to claim the right to rule. In every offering, in every festival, the people were reminded that their leaders spoke with the voice of Ashur himself. The Assyrians also began to master organization. While other cities rose and fell with each new threat, Ashur built systems, records on clay tablets, agreements sealed with cylinder seals, laws and obligations preserved for generations. These early forms of order gave them stability, a sense that their city could last. What began as survival had now become the first outlines of governance. Still, danger lurked beyond the horizon. Neighboring kingdoms often looked upon Ashur as a prize. Armies marched across the Fertile Crescent, claiming cities and enslaving populations. Yet Ashur endured. Its leaders learned the art of alliances, sometimes bending to stronger neighbors, other times standing firm. Like a tree in the wind, Ashur swayed but did not break. This resilience was not born of luxury, but of necessity. Religious devotion and political ambition walked side by side. The god Ashur was no longer just a local deity. He was the embodiment of destiny. Kings began to see themselves as chosen, not merely to rule their city, but to expand its influence. The thought of empire, still fragile, still unspoken, was slowly forming in their minds. And so, Ashur laid its foundations not in stone alone, but in spirit. Trade routes and temples, alliances and laws, gods and kings, together they formed the bedrock of something greater. The city was no longer just surviving, it was preparing for the day when it would rise beyond the banks of the Tigris and stretch its hand across the known world. The time eventually came when Ashur could no longer remain confined within its walls. What had once been a city of traders and worshippers began to feel the pull of something greater, control over the lands around it. Small expeditions turned into campaigns, and campaigns became conquest. The Assyrians had discovered a truth that would guide them for centuries. Survival was no longer enough. Power had to grow, or it would vanish. The armies of early Assyria were not yet the unstoppable force they would one day become, but they were disciplined. Warriors marched with spears and shields, bound by loyalty to their city and the god Ashur. Unlike mercenaries, they fought with purpose, believing each victory was not only for king and country, but for the divine will itself. Every battle was a ritual, every triumph a sacred duty. Conquest also brought with it new responsibilities. Lands once distant now came under Assyrian influence. To control them, the rulers developed systems of tribute. Neighboring cities were forced to send grain, livestock, and metals to Ashur as a price for peace. It was an early form of empire, fragile, yes, but powerful. Tribute not only enriched the city, it reminded others of Ashur's growing strength. Yet expansion was not without risk. Rivals were quick to notice Assyria's rise. To the south, the Babylonians watched with suspicion. To the west, the Hittites, powerful and cunning, posed a constant threat. Each victory Assyria claimed brought new enemies eager to strike. But the Assyrians, hardened by centuries of survival, embraced these dangers. For them, struggle was not a burden. It was the natural state of existence. Within the city, the kings also changed. No longer content with the humble title of Ensi, some began to style themselves as Sharu, king. The language of rule shifted. They were no longer leaders of a city. They were chosen by Ashur to rule nations. With every new campaign, the idea of empire grew less like a dream and more like destiny. And so, the dawn of expansion reshaped Assyria forever. What began as a small city on the Tigris was now a rising power, feared by its rivals and respected by its allies. The shadow of Ashur was lengthening across Mesopotamia, and though its rulers could not yet see the future, history was already whispering their fate. The age of empire was approaching. As the years passed, Assyria's rulers began to transform from simple stewards of their city into figures of great ambition. They were no longer content with defending walls or collecting tribute. Instead, they saw themselves as warrior kings, destined to extend the reach of Ashur's authority across the lands of Mesopotamia. This shift marked the beginning of a new identity for the empire, one that fused leadership with relentless conquest. The kings themselves were often men hardened by war. They rode at the front of their armies, leading by example, their presence inspiring fear and loyalty alike. They carried not just weapons, but the divine symbols of Ashur. Each campaign was not merely political, but sacred. To resist Assyria was to resist its god. And in this belief lay the foundation of their unyielding military strength. The Assyrian army, under these warrior kings, grew more organized. Soldiers were trained in formations, using shields and spears in disciplined ranks. Archers stood behind them, raining arrows on enemies, while chariots thundered across the battlefield to shatter opposing lines. What once had been a militia of city guards was now evolving into a professional force, a machine of war that would one day dominate the ancient world. Campaign after campaign, the kings pushed their borders further. They subdued neighboring tribes, brought cities under their control, and demanded loyalty sealed with tribute. Resistance was met with swift punishment. Entire towns might be dismantled, their people deported to other lands. This harsh strategy served two purposes. It spread fear among rivals and ensured that conquered populations were scattered, making rebellion less likely. But the rise of these kings was not only measured in battle. At home, their victories filled the temples with offerings. Their names were carved into stone, and their exploits sung by scribes. They were remembered as more than rulers. They were the chosen hands of Ashur, the earthly reflection of his will. Their reigns were celebrated in grand festivals, where victory was not just a political achievement, but a divine triumph. Thus, the rise of the warrior kings set the stage for Assyria's transformation from a regional power into an empire. Their vision was clear. Power must expand or it would crumble. And though their reign was often brutal, it was also unshakable. In their hands, Assyria began to stride boldly onto the stage of history, preparing for centuries of dominance and glory yet to come. The true strength of Assyria lay not only in the courage of its kings, but in the machinery of war they built. This was no ordinary army. It was the first in history to resemble a permanent, professional force. Men were trained for battle as their sole duty. They drilled with weapons, marched in formations, and were organized into ranks that could be deployed with precision. This discipline gave the Assyrians an advantage that few rivals could match. Their weapons were crafted with great care. Iron, stronger than bronze, gave their swords and spears durability in combat. Shields were large enough to form protective walls, behind which archers could unleash volleys of arrows. The chariot, once a tool of prestige, became a deadly weapon in their hands. Drawn by horses bred for speed and endurance, these chariots thundered across open plains, carrying archers who could strike with lethal accuracy. But the Assyrian genius went beyond the battlefield. They mastered the art of siege warfare. When enemies retreated behind high city walls, the Assyrians did not turn away. Instead, they devised ways to break through. Soldiers built ramps of earth to scale walls, used battering rams to shatter gates, and sometimes tunneled beneath fortifications to make them collapse. To their foes, no fortress was safe once the Assyrian army appeared on the horizon. Logistics, too, played a key role. The empire established a network of supply lines, ensuring food, water, and weapons reached their armies far from home. Couriers carried messages swiftly across vast distances, allowing kings to issue commands and receive reports in days rather than months. This efficiency gave them an edge, enabling them to strike with coordination and maintain control over lands that stretched for hundreds of miles. Yet, with all this power came fear. The Assyrians used terror deliberately, believing that a reputation for brutality could win battles before they were even fought. Captured rebels might be paraded, punished, or relocated. Tales of their ruthlessness spread quickly, discouraging uprisings and ensuring submission. For the Assyrians, fear was as much a weapon as the sword or the bow. Through these innovations, Assyria reshaped the very concept of warfare. They were not just conquerors, but architects of military science. Their strategies would echo for centuries, influencing empires long after their own had faded. And in the steady march of their soldiers, the world learned a lesson it would not soon forget: that war in the hands of the Assyrians was both an art and a destiny. The empire did not hold its vast lands by strength of arms alone. Beneath the clamor of battle and the grandeur of royal palaces lay a quieter, more insidious force: fear. The Assyrians understood that to command obedience, one had to shape the imagination as much as the sword. Cities that surrendered without resistance were often spared, but those that defied the empire learned a harsher lesson. Stories of their fate spread like whispers carried on the wind, teaching others to bend before the storm rather than be broken by it. This calculated use of terror was woven into the fabric of their rule. When a city rebelled, its leaders might be executed in public squares, while survivors were relocated to distant corners of the empire. This policy of forced migration served two purposes. It scattered potential threats and populated newly conquered territories with skilled laborers and artisans. Whole communities would vanish from one region, only to appear again hundreds of miles away, carrying with them their crafts, languages, and traditions. In this way, the empire spread both fear and culture across its domains. Religion, too, played a central role in this system of control. The king was not just a ruler. He was the chosen servant of Ashur, the chief god of the Assyrian pantheon. Obedience to the empire was framed as obedience to the divine will. To defy the king was to defy the gods themselves, and such defiance was believed to invite cosmic punishment. This belief lent a spiritual weight to Assyrian authority, binding the people not only by law but by faith. Yet within this harsh system, there were glimmers of stability. The same fear that suppressed rebellion also ensured order. Roads were safe for merchants, markets bustled with trade, and messages could travel across the empire without constant threat of ambush. For the farmer tilling his field or the artisan shaping clay, the Assyrian presence was both a burden and a shield. Life was difficult, but it was also protected beneath the vast shadow of the empire. Still, the cruelty of Assyrian rule left scars. Neighboring peoples nursed their hatred quietly, waiting for a chance to strike back. The memory of destroyed cities and broken families lingered across generations. Even as the Assyrians sought to build an eternal order, they planted the seeds of resistance in the hearts of the oppressed. In this balance of power and fear, the empire endured for centuries. But empires built on fear alone rarely last forever. Beneath the surface of stability, quiet tremors began to grow, whispers of defiance, cracks in the mighty edifice of Assyria's dominion. And though the empire could not yet see it, the shadows they cast would one day turn against them. In the heart of Assyria, there was a quieter power at work, one that did not march with spears or thunder with chariots, but one that captured time itself. The royal courts kept scribes and scholars who wrote on clay tablets with a steady reed, pressing wedge-shaped marks that would survive fires and floods. These scribes were the keepers of memory, lists of grain, letters between governors, treaties with distant kings, and prayers to the gods. Their work was patient and exact, like the slow turning of a potter's wheel, and it gave the empire a voice that could be heard long after a king's banner had fallen. The king prized these words. A tablet placed in a palace archive was more than paper or clay. It was proof that a promise had been made, that tribute had been counted, and that a law had been declared. When messages needed to fly across the empire, couriers carried sealed tablets along well-kept roads, passing messages from one relay to the next until the farthest governor had read the king's command. This network of letters and seals made distant provinces feel closer and allowed the ruler in Nineveh to move armies or resources with a speed that surprised older kingdoms. Among the greatest of these collections was the library that a king once gathered, shelves of tablets collected from temples and cities, myths copied with care, stories of old kings and the gods. Here sat copies of the great tales, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, its lines of longing and loss pressed forever into clay. In the cool hush of that archive, scribes copied, corrected, and cataloged, treating each tablet like a small light to be preserved. To the Assyrians, knowledge was both practical, houses, canals, law, and sacred, a thread that connected their present to a long past. What the library stored quietly shaped the empire's face. Military reports taught generals how to besiege a city. Administrative lists taught tax collectors what to expect at harvest. Medical recipes and omens educated healers and priests. It was not only a place of old stories, but a working workshop of wisdom that made the machinery of the state run smoothly. In that sense, the scribes were as important as the commanders. Without records, orders would falter. And without memory, an empire could not learn from its mistakes. Still, this work had its weight. To write the truth could be risky when power changed hands. Names could be added or scratched out at a ruler's whim. Some tablets were censored, some texts recarved to flatter a new king, and some scrolls were hidden away when their words were dangerous. The archive, then, was also a mirror of politics, common tone, yet reflecting the sharp turns of fortune. Even so, many tablets survived, buried in the dust of time, waiting for voices centuries later to read the quiet testimony of a vanished world. In the hush of the archive at dusk, when torchlight flickered against clay and the sound of sandals faded from the corridors, one could almost hear the past breathing. The keepers of memory worked not for glory, but for continuity. They gave the empire a slow, steady heart. Their tablets taught future generations how this civilization fought, feared, and hoped. And when centuries later we bend over their clay, listening to old names and whispered orders, we find that memory itself can be the gentlest kind of monument. Beneath the weight of empire and the clamor of armies, another force bound the Assyrians together, the temple. Rising high above the city streets, with steps that seemed to climb toward the heavens, the temples were more than places of prayer. They were the axis around which daily life revolved, where the divine touched the mortal, and where order was believed to be renewed with each ritual. To enter a temple was to step into the very heartbeat of Assyria, where stone, smoke, and silence carried the weight of eternity. The gods of Assyria were many, but at their head stood Ashur, the deity from whom the empire drew its name. To serve the king was to serve Ashur, and to defy the empire was to risk the god's wrath. Priests dressed in white tended to fires and sacrifices, offering animals, grain, and incense so that the balance between heaven and earth would not collapse. For the Assyrians, these rites were not mere symbols, they were necessities. As vital to the survival of the state as bread was to the body, every city had its patron god, and its temple was both sanctuary and treasury. People brought offerings not only to honor the divine, but also to seek healing, guidance, or forgiveness. Within the cool chambers of the sanctuaries, oracles were whispered, and priests met omens in the smoke of offerings, the flight of birds, or the patterns of oil upon water. The gods spoke in signs, and it was the task of the priests to interpret them, weaving meaning into the uncertain fabric of daily life. Temples also served a worldly purpose. They stored wealth collected from tribute and trade, managed land that fed both priests and soldiers, and even offered loans to merchants or farmers. In many ways, the temple was a partner to the palace, one ruled by decree, the other by faith. Yet together, they maintained the vast web of Assyrian society. To insult a temple or to rob it was considered not just theft, but sacrilege, an offense punishable by death. For it struck at the very heart of the cosmic balance. Festivals brought this sacred order to life with color and music. Processions carried statues of gods through the streets, the air thick with incense and chants. People gathered in celebration, believing that the gods themselves were walking among them. These moments reminded the people that they were not abandoned in a harsh world. Rather, they were under the gaze of powerful, watchful beings. It was a fragile comfort, but one that lent rhythm and meaning to lives filled with toil and uncertainty. In the quiet after such rituals, when the fires dimmed and the statues were returned to their shrines, the city would fall back into its ordinary rhythm. Yet something remained in the air, a sense of connection to something larger, something eternal. For the Assyrians, the temple was not simply stone and ritual, but a bridge, a reminder that their lives, however brief, were part of a grander story written in both heaven and earth. As centuries passed, the might of Assyria seemed unshakable. Its armies stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Persia, and its kings believed themselves chosen by the gods to rule without end. Yet beneath this aura of invincibility, cracks were forming. The weight of constant warfare drained resources and men. Cities once overflowing with wealth began to feel the strain of tribute and endless demands. The empire, though vast, carried within it the seeds of exhaustion. The Assyrians had built their empire on fear as much as on strength. Neighboring nations obeyed because they were terrified of the iron discipline of Assyrian armies. But fear, like fire, cannot burn forever. Resentment grew in the hearts of subject peoples, waiting only for the right moment to ignite. And slowly, alliances began to form in the shadows. Babylon, the Medes, and others who had long suffered under the Assyrian yoke whispered of revenge. Within the empire, succession disputes weakened the royal line. Brothers turned against brothers, sons against fathers, each claiming the throne as their divine right. Civil strife drained what little stability remained. Even the once mighty city of Nineveh began to feel vulnerable, its walls tall but its spirit divided. Assyria's brilliance, so dazzling for centuries, now flickered like a torch in the wind. The natural world, too, seemed to conspire against them. Famine struck regions that had once fed armies. Rebellions erupted not on distant borders, but closer to the heart of Assyria itself. The empire's own governors, seeing weakness in the capital, sometimes acted as kings in all but name. The very system that had brought order to chaos began to unravel into confusion and despair. And so, while the world still trembled at the name of Assyria, its power was no longer eternal. The empire had reached the edge of its great arc, the high point from which it could only descend. In the silence of the Mesopotamian night, one could almost sense the approaching storm. For empires, like men, do not fall in a single instant. They crumble slowly, quietly, and then all at once. In the year 612 BCE, the storm finally broke. The Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians gathered their forces into a coalition the world had never seen. They marched upon Nineveh, the jewel of Assyria, determined to end the empire that had once crushed them. The siege lasted months, with fire and steel battering the walls that had stood for generations. Inside, the Assyrians fought with desperate courage, but their numbers and spirit were no longer enough. The Tigris River, swollen and relentless, broke through part of Nineveh's defenses. Nature itself seemed to turn against the Assyrians. As the waters rushed in, invaders poured through the breach, carrying fire and vengeance. Palaces that had once echoed with the voices of kings now roared with the sound of destruction. The city burned, its great libraries scattered, its people slaughtered or enslaved. When the flames finally died, the once great Assyrian Empire was no more. Its memory lived only in ruins, in shattered statues and broken walls half buried by the sands of Mesopotamia. The names of its kings faded into silence, and its power was remembered only as a warning whispered across the centuries. And yet, not all was lost. In the ashes of Nineveh, fragments of clay tablets survived, words that carried the epic of Gilgamesh, myths, prayers, and records of an empire that had once ruled the known world. These fragments, fragile yet enduring, kept Assyria alive in history even when its cities lay forgotten. For the Assyrian Empire was not merely an empire of conquest. It was also an empire of memory. Its rise and fall remain a reminder of how greatness can blaze like fire and then vanish into shadow, leaving behind only echoes for us to hear in the quiet of night. And so ends the story of Assyria, a civilization born in the cradle of Mesopotamia, rising with iron will and fierce ambition, ruling through both brilliance and brutality. It soared higher than most, only to fall into silence, swallowed by the very shadows it once cast. Yet as we wander through its ruins in thought, guided by whispers of history, we find not only the story of kings and wars, but of humanity itself, our hopes, our pride, our triumphs, and our mistakes. The Assyrian Empire reminds us that all things, no matter how mighty, are fleeting. And in this fleetingness, there is a strange and calming beauty. As you drift now into rest, imagine the quiet plains of Mesopotamia under a silver moon. The cities are gone, the armies silent, but the memory of Assyria lingers like a soft echo carried on the wind. In that echo lies not fear, but peace, the peace of knowing that history, like life, flows and fades, only to rise again in another form. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the shadows of the ancient world guide you gently towards sleep. For tonight, the story has ended, but the dream continues.